Well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning for even more hidden treasures of Boston. And today specifically, Jay will be focusing on things you can do for free in and around Boston. So we're going to get an inside look at some of Boston's hidden treasures from popular Boston tour guide Jay Bazinati. He also is a corporal in the 1st New Hampshire Regiment of Revolutionary War reenactors. He's not in costume this morning, but we've seen him in his costume before, so we can confirm this. Much of Boston's rich and fascinating history is invisible, not just to the casual visitor, but also to those who have lived here all their lives. So looking forward to learning more about Boston once again from Jay, again sponsored by the Friends of the Tewksbury Library and in partnership with the Manchester by the Sea Library. So all 50 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jay for joining us this morning. And Jay, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Robert. I appreciate the invite to be here today. Again, my name is Jay Bazinati. I've been doing tours part-time as an amateur and semi-professional for about 30 years around Boston. And as a result of doing that, I've collected a lot of things, information that I thought would be interesting to parcel out to people. When I first started doing this, I thought I would end up with like 15 slides and I'd be doing finger puppets on the presentation, but it turns out that it ended up being over 350 slides in 7 parts. And this is part 4, which is my favorite presentation, actually, 3 things to do around Boston. So this presentation, as all the presentations that I do, are broken into 2 parts. The first part is cool things that come from Boston, because Boston is a very historical city, and I think is the best city that I've been to, and I've been to 23 countries and 46 states. So the second part of the presentation is the free stuff you can do. And there's actually a considerable amount of free things that you can do in Boston. So that being said, I think I'm going to jump into the presentation, which should last about an hour, including some time at the end for questions and answers if you have any. I also want to point out that I am not a worldwide expert. There are things I don't know. And if you do know something, or if you know a hidden thing or a secret thing or a cool thing, and you want to shoot me a message, please let me know. I'm always interested in learning more, and there's always more to learn. So that being said, I am going to start with the presentation. So the first part of the presentation is cool things from around the Boston area. And I'm very liberal about the word Boston because it tends to include Massachusetts. So what we have is Castle Island. I know that many of you are aware that in Boston, there's an island called Castle Island. This is a picture of it from the sky. At one time, this was an actual island. It was a fortified spot since the time before the Pilgrims even came here. Even the Indians used this as a fortified location. At first, there were just some earthworks that were thrown up with cannon. And when the fort was first built, it was built to defend Boston from, of all things, the Portuguese and the Dutch. So they would come in from time to time and they would fire cannons at Boston because England was in warfare with Holland for a very long time. So what we have today is this fort that was built in around 1833. The British used that area. It was a wooden palisade for a fort during the Revolutionary War. It was built up, and Edgar Allan Poe worked here for a while. It's where he got the idea for his story, The Last Cask, where a British soldier was found built into the walls of the fort for real. And so he wrote a story that was similar to that. This park is only open on Sundays, and they do give tours. It's much smaller than the fort that's just like it on George's Island. All these things and everything that I talk about is with the caveat that we don't know what COVID has done to availability. Where I do know, I will let you know. So the first licensed bar in America was here in 1634, 4 years after Boston was founded. The first bar in America was actually in New Amsterdam, but it was a couple of boards thrown over a couple of casks. This was a real bar. It was opened by Samuel Cole, and they did provide food and drink, and they also provided plays. Now, it was very difficult for them to perform plays in those days because the Puritans did not like any kind of business of that nature. And in fact, they fought it for well over 150 years. It wasn't until well into the 1800s that this kind of entertainment or any kind of serious entertainment was approved. And we have an expression, banned in Boston, which is used all over the country because the founding fathers of Boston were very adamantly against providing this kind of ungodly behavior. By the way, just as a point, the oldest surviving bar in America is the White Horse Tavern in Newport, Rhode Island, which I happened to drive by last year. This is the first public park in America, is the Boston Common. As you know, the Boston Common was used as a place to graze cattle and sheep. And you may be familiar with the Tragedy of the Commons, which was a tract written by Thomas Malthus, where he said that if the common could support some number of cows, let's say 100, by 10 farmers, and each farmer had 10 cows, well, one of the farmers could add a cow secretly, an 11th cow, and nobody would know, and he would make an extra profit. And everybody could keep on doing this until the common was destroyed. So that was the tragedy of the commons. That was the theory of environmentalism that came back even back in the day. So this common has been used for many things. And one of the things was, this is where people were hung when they did bad things. There were actually 2 hanging trees in the Boston Common. One was near where the frog pond is now. And there actually is a little memorial where, if you can find it, it's quite hidden, near the frog pond, that says this is where the elm was that was used to hang people. But it was only used to hang people of quality. So if you were an important or rich person, you were lucky enough to be hung from or hanged from the elm tree. If you were an average commoner, there was a dead tree struck by lightning that was near the Charles River that they would hang you on instead. So even there was separation of classes even back when it came to being executed. Boston was founded by William Blackston. He came here to get away from the crowds of pilgrims in Charlestown, and because he was a nudist and he liked to walk around naked, and the Puritans didn't really like that very much. So what you're looking at in this picture here is the Parkman Bandstand. The Parkman Bandstand was built as the result of the crime of the century in the 1800s, the murder of George Parkman. So I've talked about that in other presentations, and I don't want to get hung up on it, but that's the central point of the Boston Common, is the Parkman Bandstand, which was put there, paid for by George Parkman's son, who was just a little boy when his father was killed. The man that was killed for it was a man named Webster, who was a professor at Harvard. So eventually the park became surrounded by buildings, and they stopped grazing and allowing people to put their cows and chickens and sheep there in around 1836. On one part of it, there was a very large cemetery, which was mostly dug up to connect Boylston Street with Tremont Street. Now, one of the famous people in that cemetery is Gilbert Stewart, who's the man that painted the picture of George Washington that you've seen, that has the little white part at the bottom where it was unfinished. So this Boston Common was also important because this was where George Washington dismissed the American Army after the Revolutionary War. Important to me because I'm a member of the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, was the first regiment inducted into the Army and the last one mustered out here on Boston Common. And you know, in the public gardens, there's a big statue of George Washington doing just that. The first college in America, we call it Harvard now, but they called it Newtown back in 1630. It became Harvard in 1638. John Harvard, the man who it's named after, donated 780 pounds, which was greater than the entire budget of the Massachusetts colony at the time. He also donated 369 books. Surprisingly, John Harvard never went to Harvard College. He never visited it. He lived in near the North End. There's a little park where he lived now, a monument. His house was burned down many years ago, but there is a monument to where he lived. He came over as a preacher but he died of a disease. It's ironic because he came to America to escape the bubonic plague in Europe, and then he died here of a disease. But while he was here, he became very enamored of the Newtown College and donated all this money. So what they did was they made this statue that you see in the picture to him. And it was made by Daniel Chester French, who also made the statue of Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and many other statues in Boston as well. This is called the Statue of Three Lies, because at the bottom of this statue it reads, "Here is John Harvard, founder of Harvard College, 1630. Well, none of those things is true. They didn't know what Harvard looked like, so they got a college student to model for this statue. Harvard wasn't founded in 1630. It was founded in 1638. It was Newtown College before it was Harvard. And I'm trying to think of the three lies. It's not him. It wasn't 1630, and it wasn't Harvard. It was Newtown College. Now, if you look at the bottom of that picture, you can see his shoe is quite shiny, because there's a legend that if you walk by and rub his shoe, it's good luck. That legend was started by Harvard students who on graduation day pee on that foot. So if you're going to rub Harvard's foot, you're rubbing the pee of many thousands of Harvard graduates. Harvard was one of the first schools in the Ivy League, and the reason why it's called the Ivy League was because the original schools, there were only 4 of them. They determined the rules of football in 1864, and those 4 schools, IV, became the Ivy League. America's first coffee house. Now, coffee was starting to come into popularity in the 1600s, and this coffee house was called the Green Dragons on Union Street, probably close to where the Union Oyster House is now. So coffee was not as popular as tea until the Revolutionary War, when tea became banned in Boston. So in order to get their caffeine fix, people switched over to coffee. Notice that women were not allowed in these shops, any of these shops. And as time went on, the women who came to work in these shops were known as women of ill repute, even though they were waitresses. The circular saw, 1813, invented by a woman named Tabitha Babbitt. This is a device that changed the world. Now, this picture is taken much later than the original saw was made, which she made in 1813. There were no photographs in 1813. This saw that you're looking at here is actually an ice saw, because one of the big uses for circular saws was to cut up the ponds and make ice. And as I talk about in other presentations, Boston was the center of the ice trade for the Caribbean and for India. A man named Tudor started the ice warehouse, the Boston Ice Company, and he made an enormous fortune shipping ice all over the world and trading it for fruits and vegetables. So, as you can imagine, the circular saw changed the entire industry. And in fact, there are actually rules about the width of the circular saw, depending on what country you're from. Because, and that width, by the way, is called the kerf. And thicker kerfs are allowed in America. And in England, only thinner kerfs are allowed because they have fewer trees and therefore can afford less waste. The first off-the-suit rack was made here by John Simmons. He was a tailor that joined his brother. He came to Boston and they were tailors here. And they began to realize after doing a lot of work that men came in common sizes. And Simmons was very sympathetic to women at the time in 1822 who were not allowed to work outside the home. They had no way of making money. So what he did was he would parcel out work to them in their homes, and they would make these off-the-rack suits. And this provided valuable money for women who didn't have much way of getting an income in those days. So by the end of the Civil War, he was the largest clothing manufacturer in the United States. There was a Simmons department store here for a while, and he started Simmons College in 1870. He donated a ton of money to allow women the opportunity to get ahead, and that college still exists today. Oops, I'm sorry, I pushed the wrong button. First garden cemetery in America. So here's a great trivia question. What is the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard? A graveyard always has a church. A cemetery may not. So Mount Auburn Cemetery is patterned after the cemeteries in Europe when they were starting to get away from the whole sadness of death. They were trying to do the celebration of death, so they made cemeteries which were parks. Mount Auburn Cemetery is one of the greatest places in Boston that you can go. It's free to go. I'll be talking about it a little bit later. It's 170 acres and many, many, many famous people. Now, to take the guided tour there, it's very, very expensive, but you can get an audio tour for very little money and walk around and see some of the incredible tombs and the money that people have spent on them there. This, by the way, is a Civil War tomb that you're looking at, this Sphinx. The Sphinx back in the time of the Civil War had specific meaning. I'm going to blow right by this. I used to live by this factory. This is the oldest machine tool factory in America. It's in Fitchburg. It's still there. It's called Simon's Mill, and they made all kinds of cutting products. First women's college in America. Now you can imagine 1837, women going into college was a big deal. It became exclusively for women in 1837. It's located in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and it's still there, but it failed as an all-women's college in 1999 and was taken over by Hobby Lobby, who made it a Pentecostal church, but it is no longer accredited, and actually the reputation of the school is not very good. So now we're back at Mount Auburn Cemetery again. The first Package Express company, which is the predecessor of UPS, was started here by a man named Thomas Harden. And what he would do is he would ship boxes of packages around the country on the railroads. And he started the Pinkerton Detective Agency to protect his business. So there were a number of businesses that sprung up, but during World War I, Woodrow Wilson forced them to consolidate because express packaging became very strategic to the country. So right now, the company that he started is enormous and is a big shareholder of American Express. And this is a very interesting gravestone. If you go and see this in the cemetery, you can see he has his faithful dog at the bottom, and then there's a briefcase that you can't see, and in the back there is a package that's all wrapped up, made out of stone, to commemorate what his business was. First department store was Jordan Marsh. This is really interesting. Those of you who are from Boston and know Boston history, you will always remember going to the Jordan Marsh. There was no Macy's or nothing like that. We had Jordan Marsh was the high-end department store. This started in 1841. And the interesting thing about this store was Jordan Marsh, Eben Jordan started the Boston Globe as a penny saver to drive people to his store. And the Boston Globe became a separate entity all in its right. Jordan Marsh closed in 1996, sold out to Macy's, and there's nothing left of it now, but good memories. I love this story, the story of Erastus Clapp, the first detective in America. America had the first police force in America, founded in 1838, and it was based on the Peelian principles developed in London by Sir Robert Peel, who started the London Police Department. So they wanted to follow those same noble purposes. There's 12 of them, and they still are followed today, and they should be. The very first one is that the police should have the support of the people that they police. So by the mid-1800s, unofficial private detectives were starting to spring up, but Boston decided that it needed a real detective force. So they hired Erastus Clapp, who was very, very vigilant. Erastus Clapp was the man who arrested George Webster, who was hanged for the killing of Parkman, who we talked about earlier. Clapp arrested thousands of suspects in his life. This little drawing you see on the left was a picture of him going to arrest Webster that was published in a local newspaper. So we all know about the Monitor and the Merrimack, which were the two ironclad warships that fought at Hampton Roads. The Confederate vessel was actually built here in Boston as a wooden sailing ship. It was trapped in the harbor, ran aground, and they scuttled it, but the Confederates raised it, plated it over with iron, and turned it into the CSS Virginia. We knew it as the Merrimack. So the actual first ironclad in history was the French Glory, launched in 1859, but it was really pretty primitive. And following that, the English developed the first ironclad ocean-going battleship called the Amazon, which is still in England today, and you can actually go on it. So we had the first police officer, actual police officer, killed in the line of duty, 1857. This is a terrible thing to commemorate, but it's good to remember. His name was, the first law officer in America was Darius Quimby, killed in Albany, but it wasn't an official police force. He was just an unpaid constable. So the first professional officer killed was Ezekiel Hodson, who was killed stopping a break-in near Maverick Station in what's now East Boston in 1857. In 1857, East Boston was a pretty wild place. People came to his funeral from all over America because this was such a big deal. It was unheard of that a policeman would be killed, and his killers were never caught. First YMCA in America. YMCA was started in England. This YMCA still exists on Huntington Avenue. It started its own technical school, which became Northeastern, and it still has the same mission it always has. I've actually stayed in this YMCA in the 1980s. First public garden in America. We have the Boston Public Garden, 1859. There's George Washington dismissing his troops. You'll notice that his hand is splayed out. He carries a sword. The sword is made of plastic because it's been stolen so many times that now they only make it out of plastic. This statue was made by Thomas Ball. It's considered the greatest statue in America. So if you haven't been to the Public Garden, you should go. It is one of the most beautiful places in Boston, and I make it a point to go there many times every year in the summer. I used to play in this railroad yard as a child. This is the only fully gravity-employed railroad yard in the U.S. and the last one in Boston. So this part of the railroad yard that you're looking at now is gone. It is being torn up to be made into other things. They store Boston school buses there. But a gravity rail yard works by letting the trains roll down the hill, and then they're shunted off onto these separate tracks into what's called consists that are taken to various locations where they're all supposed to go. So all the trains come in from all over the country, and then they're gathered into trains that are going to Maine or going to New Hampshire or going to New York on one long set, and then they're taken away. The first arboretum in America, Arnold Arboretum, was built on 400 acres that were donated by some whalers and a Boston businessman named Benjamin Bussey, for whom Bussey Street is named. And the bridge over Bussey Street was the scene of one of the greatest train accidents in America, the Bussey Street Bridge disaster, where a bridge was built by the lowest bidder, a man who had no experience building bridges. And when the train went over it carrying commuters into Boston, it collapsed and a lot of people died. In any event, Harvard owns the Arnold Arboretum. They have many walking paths and trails. One of the best things you can do, I highly recommend, and it's free, is the Mother's Day walk for lilacs every year on Mother's Day. The lilacs start to bloom right around Mother's Day, and it's a very beautiful thing. And there are thousands and thousands of people who come to experience the lilacs of the Arnold Arboretum. This is after my own heart. My father was a carpenter, and I am a carpenter hobbyist. And L.J. Starrett, who still exists today, invented the combination square, one of the most important tools a carpenter can have. Now, this was made out of Athol in Massachusetts, and Athol is the site of many tool makers, had been the site of many tool makers, and also there's a large waterfall there, which is great to go swimming in. So L.J. Starrett is reputed to be the best measurement tool maker in the entire world. And if you can get a Starrett combination square, they're very expensive, but they're very good tools. This part of the presentation talks a little bit about things in Boston that we have lost, things that I've used to talk about in the tours, but are now gone. The Sparks Fire Museum. So Boston has burned down more than any city in America. So you would think that as a result of that, we would have a great fire museum. Well, we do have a fire museum, but it's actually pretty crappy, because we did have a fire museum called the Sparks Fire Museum. But during the 80s, when Boston was the arson capital of the world, the Sparks Fire Museum was burned down by arsonists, and all the artifacts were burned. So it turns out that the arson ring was being run by the arson investigator who was in head of arson for the state police. So they finally broke it up because of a fire at that train station, which we saw here. This was also the Garrity Lumber Yard. The fire here was taped by WNAC Channel 7, and they were actually able to see the fire starters, and they were able to break up the fire ring as a result of that. But the problem was that the museum was lost. John Hancock Tower Observatory was lost after 9/11 in 2001. So at the top of this tower, there was the only 360-degree view. I'm sorry, it wasn't 360, it was 270-degree view of Boston from the highest location. It was a great observation deck. However, after 2001, after 9/11, it was closed for safety reasons. And then the people who owned the building decided they could make a lot more money by turning it into offices. So, some of you may remember the Spinnaker Lounge, that little square box on the top of the Hyatt. The Hyatt is still there in Cambridge, used to have a spinning restaurant inside that would go round and round. It would make one revolution an hour, and you could go up and sit in this club, have food, have drinks, go dancing, and spin around. It was quite the destination. Sorry that it was lost. It's still there. All the machinery is still there, but it's too expensive to fix and make work again. This is something that has bothered me for years. This is the loss of the Alexander Graham Bell Museum. So when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, he had a building on what is now JFK Plaza near City Hall. And there is a monument there, part of Hidden Boston, to the building where he made that phone. So when they dismantled that whole block, Mr. Watson, of Mr. Watson, Come Here, I Need You fame, he supervised the dismantling of the lab, which was completely and faithfully reconstructed in the lobby of this building in front of you, which was the AT&T building at the time. Now, there was a massive mural painted that commemorated the development of the telephone, and it was a museum where anybody could go for free and see all of Alexander Graham Bell's original laboratory and the original parts from the original phone and all that stuff. So AT&T sold the building to Verizon in 2006, and everything disappeared. Now, in the years since, I've been looking high and low for what became of it. I've been to the building, I've talked to the managers, nobody can tell you anything. However, within the past 5 years, the mural that was inside turned up in Newport in a private museum. But the rest of the lab and all the stuff that's in it is gone. The Higgins Army Museum, to me, is a great loss. This was located in Worcester. It was the greatest collection of medieval armor in North America. So this guy, John Higgins, was a steel magnate. He made pressed steel, and he used a lot of his money to develop this museum inside his factory. And as time went on, the museum got bigger and bigger, and the factory got smaller and smaller until he moved the machine someplace else. And in this entire building, he built a complete castle inside. So if you were to go in this building during that time, you would be walking through a real castle and seeing all of the armor. So over time, Worcester fell into depression and people didn't go to the museum so much. And it finally collapsed. And the armor was broken up and went hither and yon. And the Worcester Art Museum has a lot of the artifacts, which you can still see today, but it's nothing like what it was back in the day. I grew up, I went to school in Fitchburg, so I used to go to this museum a lot. This is probably the biggest loss we've ever suffered, and people don't even know it. This was the Museum of World War II in Natick, was the largest private World War II museum in the world, and it had both the original Versailles Treaty and the surrender document signed on the USS Missouri at the end of World War II, and you could look at both of them. When I first went to the museum, you could actually flip the pages of the Versailles Treaty, but in later times, they put it under a glass box. So in order to go to this museum, you actually had to get an appointment. So the guy who owned it died, and the museum was sold off, and all the artifacts are gone. It's really too bad. This is a tragedy right here. This was what I considered the jewel of Boston tours, was the absolute best tour you could go on in Boston, was to visit Boston Light on Little Brewster Island. So you would get on a boat, and the boat would take you over to the island, and the last lighthouse keeper in America, a woman named Sally Snowman, would take you up to the top of the lighthouse and show you the original Fresnel light and give you a tour of the entire island. And it is so incredibly interesting. They have a pet cemetery there for all the lighthouse keepers who buried their pets who died on the island. Harvard did all kinds of foghorn research, so there are all kinds of foghorns. And back in those days, they used to fire cannons to alert ships if the bells weren't loud enough. So a lot of these old rusty cannons are all still there. And the house that you see in the back there is tied down by chains to keep the waves from washing it away. So around the time that COVID came in, the federal government came in and took over the island, and now there are no longer any tours. They said it was too dangerous to go up to the top of the tower and that there were no bathrooms, so no one can go there anymore, but you can sail around it, which I think is kind of a ripoff. It makes me really mad. And so last year, we also lost the Prudential Tower observation deck and restaurant, which was also a tragedy. It was really pretty expensive to go up there, like $25, but nevertheless, it was the only 360-degree view of the city, and it was the highest place you could go to get it. So then you could also go to the top of the Hub restaurant, which was extremely romantic. It's too bad the food was only second rate, but you weren't going for the food, you were going there for the view. So I'm very, very sad that that is gone. Some important restaurants that we've lost. Doyle's closed a couple of years ago, opened 150 years. Almost every major movie that was made in Boston was shot at Doyle's at one point or another. Jacob Wirth, the second oldest restaurant in America, now gone. This was a German restaurant. You could get authentic German food. Durgan Park, which was the last surviving business of the original businesses in Faneuil Hall, was closed. It was bought by a New York firm. It wasn't making enough profit, so they closed it a couple of years ago. Amrines, which is still open, but will soon be closing because they're going to turn Amrines, which has the first bar tap in America. They can make more money putting condos on that spot. Loch Ober, fourth oldest restaurant, was an exclusive men's club, gone, and Cheers is gone too. So we had a lot of department stores here. They're gone. Jordan Marsh is gone. Stearns, the Stearns building is now an office building. Filene's, Gilchrist's, Lechmere. Lechmere was quite famous for being a discount store. Grossman's, which was a salvage operation, which sold lumber. And Bradley's, people may remember Bradley's. These were all familiar names to people who lived in Boston, but are now gone. Lots of famous magazines come from Boston. The oldest magazine in America is the Old Farmer's Almanac, but that actually comes from New Hampshire, but I put it in there as a cheat because it was from around here and it's really old. So Scientific American, Good Housekeeping. I didn't even know that when I was doing this research. I was pretty excited to find that out. My favorite magazine, the Atlantic Monthly, now called the Atlantic. The people that started this went on to start Houghton Mifflin Publishers as well. So a lot of famous magazines from Massachusetts as well. So that's the end of the first part of the presentation. And now I'm going to talk about all the cool free things I like to do in Boston. If I have people come to Boston, one of the very first things I have them do is go to the Charlestown Navy Yard. The Charlestown Navy Yard is enormous, and it is a great way to spend a whole day or just an afternoon. And it is the center of a lot of things that you can get to. So here is the home of the USS Constitution, which I think is the greatest thing in Boston. Right? The oldest commissioned warship afloat in America, not the oldest commissioned warship, that's the Victory in England. Right? The Cass and Young is also here. This is representative of the types of ships that were made in Boston during World War II. And it's named after a hero of Pearl Harbor who was blown off his ship, swam back, went on, continued fighting, then got a new ship and was killed by a kamikaze later on in the war. The museums here are all free as well. There's a free museum that talks about the shipbuilding, and there's a free museum that talks specifically about the Constitution and life on the Constitution and how it was built. There is a really nasty ship-type galley that they serve fried food. So if you want to get food there, that's good too, because there's not very many places around there where you can get food. What's really cool is they have the water shuttle here. You can go right back downtown Boston. So you go to Long Wharf for $3.50. It's a trip across the harbor for $3.50. You can't beat it. The Korean War Memorial is here with its park and fountains. It is a beautiful place to go and relax. You can stick your feet in the fountains. They used to allow you to swim in the fountains, but not anymore. It's an easy walk to Bunker Hill Monument. You can walk to Codfish Park and Paul Revere Park, and then over to the north end and get some food. And along the way between Boston and the Navy Yard is a walk across the locks, which I'll talk about. I have a slide later, and you can watch the locks working and the ships going up and down through the Charles River in Boston Harbor. This is my absolute favorite tour that I try to give to everybody who comes to Boston. It's only about 90 minutes. This is the Boston Public Library tour. For my mind, this is the greatest thing in Boston. This building was built by McKim, Mead and White, is one of the first libraries in America. Everything you are looking at is some kind of art piece. It's so incredible how much history and art is here, and how many artists, sorry about that, how many artists were involved in the building of this building. My favorite part is in that center colorful painting in the middle. That was the original waiting room. There are a set of 14 huge paintings of the search for the Holy Grail. Now, we all talk about Harry Potter now, and Harry Potter is huge all around the world. But back in the 1840s, the Harry Potter of its time was the Lord Tennyson story about the Lady in the Lake, the search for the Holy Grail. And people think that it was King Arthur who went to look for the Holy Grail, but it wasn't. It was Sir Galahad and Sir Bors. And this tells the whole story. All the paintings tell the story of Sir Galahad going off to find the Holy Grail. And many artists were involved, including John Singer Sargent, who helped paint the very last frame. Now, in the lower part, you can see the two lions that were commissioned by the 20th Massachusetts Infantry Division during the Civil War. This was the only division that was made up of people from all over the state instead of particular divisions from different regions of the state. And the officers were many famous people, and they paid for these statues to be put in here. These statues were copied by the New York Public Library, which calls their lions Patience and Fortitude. So, on the other hand, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you see a statue of a woman holding a baby, and she has a set of grapes, and she is celebrating life. This was a statue made by a man named McMonnies, and when it came out, and when the library was done, it was said that it was obscene, and they banned it in Boston, and the New York Public Library bought it right away, where the original still stands. So after a while, Boston came to its senses, and they tried to get the statue back, but naturally New York would not give it to Boston. Boston and New York hating each other as they do. And so the original sculptor went and built a copy, of which this is the copy here. Now, the interesting thing about this copy that you can't tell by looking at this picture is that the man who banned the statue, his bust is directly opposite her gaze on the wall. So for all eternity, he has to look at the statue that he banned. So 90 minutes, free tour, couldn't be better. Highly recommend, 5 stars, please go do it. It's an afternoon so well spent. So the Massachusetts State House is also a museum, and it's free to take the tour. So they tell you all about the building and the history of the building in Massachusetts and Beacon Hill. There are many cool things about this. At one time, Massachusetts used to extend all the way up to Maine, and that is why on the top of the Beacon Hill, which you can't really see in this picture, is a pine cone. Now, it must be remembered that on the top of Beacon Hill, instead of this building, there was a 100-foot pole with a bunch of pine cones in it. And if there was an emergency in Boston, they would set those pine cones on fire, and it could be seen from miles around, and people would come to see what the trouble was. So the oldest artifact brought to Europe from America from Europe is a cannon dredged up from the Spanish Armada, which sank in, I think, 1522 off England, and it sits in the courtyard of this building, and it was given to Boston by Winston Churchill. You can get all kinds of tours of this building. I highly recommend it. I went and took a private tour here about 10 years ago. And after the tour was over, I had to go to the bathroom. So I went to the restroom, and there in the sink, I found a walkie-talkie and a gun. So I left the bathroom quickly and told them that there was a walkie-talkie and a gun in the bathroom. And it turns out that the guard went in and used the bathroom, and he left his stuff there by accident. This is also a very cool thing that I take people to right away when they come to Boston, because it's easy, it's free, and it's beautiful. So this is the Independence Wharf on an observation deck. This is the building, this is the place. This building is on Griffin's Wharf, where the Boston Tea Party was originally held. And in fact, on the right-hand corner of that building, there's a great big star in the pavement telling you where the Boston Tea Party was. Now, the top of that building is an observation deck, which you can go up. It's like 14 stories. It gives you a complete view of Boston Harbor and South Boston. And what you're looking at, I think this is the view from the top, in the top picture. And what you're looking at there is the barking crab with the orange stripes. And right behind it is the Envoy Hotel, which has a rooftop deck as well and a rooftop restaurant. Very expensive, but it's well worth going to. So you can bring people to Boston and take them up to this free observation deck and see the roads, the Greenway as well. I will point out an important factor about this observation deck. No one goes there. So it's very romantic. It's a great place to bring your sweetie and have a big smooch while looking out at the city. Highly recommend. Deer Island Sewage Treatment Plant. Now, this is a very little known free tour that you can take of the most advanced sewage treatment plant in America. So this thing was built for $9 billion, was finished on time and under budget, and processes all the water, sewage water, from 47 communities around Boston, 350 million gallons a day. Only 2% is solid waste. And when I say solid waste, I hope you know what I mean. The rest is all water, and there's also dead dogs and tree limbs and beer cans and things like that they siphon out. They filter that out. So the water is clean to Class 2 standards, which means it's good for animals to drink, but not people. And then it's shipped under a 9-mile pipe out to the Grand Banks, where it's dumped into the water, and all the fish eat whatever is left. All the solid waste is put on trains, and it's shipped to Florida, where they use it for fertilizer on orange groves. And then they have the other trains, which have all the dead dogs and the broken tree branches and beer cans and all the other stuff that is left behind. And they put that on trains, and they take it to Idaho, where they dump it in a giant pit. Now, there was an unexpected occurrence as a result of doing this. And what has happened is the giant pit in Idaho starts to green over when it rains. The few times it rains, the giant pit starts to have grass grow on it because of all this waste that we've dumped there from Boston. So in order to go take this tour, you have to get an FBI background check, but it's free and it's really interesting. And there's a lot of history there as well. There's also a running track that goes around it that you can walk as well, but that's outside the sewage treatment plant. You can't get into the plant from the running track. This thing is so close to my heart. This is the MAP model room in Boston. This is in City Hall. This is your right as a taxpayer to view. It's free. They give guided tours on Tuesdays to anybody, but you can go anytime and just look at it. And what it is a gigantic, and when I say gigantic, it fills an enormous room. It is a wooden model of Boston. It's just like that model that they used in Indiana Jones, where Indiana Jones goes down and puts the staff in, and it flashes the light at where the Grail is supposed to be. So what they've done is, when they want to see what the impact of a new building or highway is going to do to Boston, they come and they build it here in this little room first. And all those buildings that you see are made of basswood and other kinds of wood, and they're all detachable, and they can plug in different things to see what it would look like. And if you take the tour, they tell you about the buildings, and they also tell you what they're going to be building in the future. And they'll put the little buildings in spot to show you what it looks like. It really is beautiful. And it smells great too, because it's all wood. So I again, this is my favorite presentation of all of them, And I can't recommend enough that people go see this giant model. Here's another thing that I love. I jump up and down. If I could jump up and down, I would jump up and down now. The Boston Harbor Summer Series is a free series of movies and concerts right here on this deck that they do every night of the week except Saturday and Sunday during the summer. So they have a different type of music every single night. One night it's jazz, one night it's blue, one night it's swing, one night it's pop, and so on. And on Fridays, they have a family movie. And it's free, but you can also reserve tables and buy food as well. So you can go dancing, watch the bands, get married in that little tower that you see down there, little gazebo, or you can watch the movies. This is one of the greatest things about Boston. And the fact that this is provided by the Boston Harbor Hotel for free is such a great thing. There is nothing better on a summer night than having dinner in the North End and walking down here to listen to some music. Now that's romance. The Esplanade also does a summer series where they have music and concerts too. They do concerts on Wednesdays and Fridays. There are also walking tours. And so the Boston Pops started playing here, and started in 1885, and they started playing here in 1929. This park was donated with a donation from the wife of the ex-mayor of Boston in the 1930s, with the proviso that there would never be traffic allowed here. And they agreed to do that. And the year she died, they opened up Storrow Drive. Mount Auburn Cemetery, I spoke about a little bit earlier. This is a great tour. It is a beautiful place to go. Bring a bag lunch. You can sit on some of these monuments. The one on the bottom is the Mary Baker Eddy monument and gravesite. And you can, eat your lunch there. It's really wonderful there on that little lake. But the best thing about it is Washington Tower. At the highest point, there's a little tower which you can climb up the steps and go out on the roof, and it has the best view of Boston from the west that you can possibly get. And the theme for me going through this is it's very romantic. It's a great place to steal a smooch from your sweetie. Oh, all free. The Freedom Trail. Boston is known for being the start of America, where the first shot heard around the world was fired, and so on and on. So what they've done is they've painted a red track that goes around the whole city, takes about 3 hours, and it takes you to all the various historical sites. One of the things about this that most people don't know is that even though it's free, the very first tour of the day, which starts at 8:30, is given by a park ranger. None of the other tours, none of the other times is anybody giving you the tour. You have to either get a book or you just walk around and look at the stuff and you have no idea what you're looking at. But at 8:30, the Freedom Trail is provided with a ranger for free. But by the way, it becomes very crowded and they cut off the number of people who can go if you don't get there early enough. I want to take a second to talk about this building. This is the old State House. This is a very boring building. It costs some money to get inside, but there's really not that much to see. I don't really recommend it so much. But the thing about it is that this was the seat of English government. And if you look at the top of the building on the corners, you can see on the left there's a lion, and on the right there is a unicorn. When England was in charge of America, this was the symbol of English power. And when the Americans took over, the very first thing they did when the English evacuated Boston was they pulled down the lion and the unicorn. And those things were put back later to recreate the building's original appearance. The lion and the unicorn became the symbol of England in 1605, when King James from Scotland became the King of England to symbolize their coming together. By the way, the Declaration of Independence was first read from that balcony there you see in front of me. The Bunker Hill Monument is also free, 239 steps, 294 steps to the top. And believe me, if you're not in good shape, you're going to feel it, let me tell you. It's quite a climb to get up there. And it's really kind of claustrophobic at the top, considering there's also a cannon up there. There's the Molly Stark cannon is up there that was used by John Stark during the Battle of Bunker Hill. So This was built before the Washington Monument, and the granite fort came from the Quincy quarries, and it was barged over from the quarries, and it was built here. The cool thing about this is, as I've talked about before, is that there are a lot of things nearby that you can easily walk to, and it's free. It's a national park. It belongs to you. You should take advantage of it. If I have people come to Boston, this is again, number one of the first places I will take them, to Arlington Street Church. The Arlington Street Church has the largest collection of Tiffany glass windows in the world today. All those windows you see on the side are all made out of Tiffany glass. And Tiffany glass is not flat glass. It is layer after layer of three-dimensional glass that has texture. And it allows, when the light hits it from the sun, it creates all kinds of patterns on the floor and in the building itself. So one of the interesting things about this was that when the glass was put into the building in the 1920s, Louis Tiffany went out of business before he finished the job. So a couple of the windows are empty. But in 1972, when busing was coming into Boston, some right-wing agitators came to the church because the church was pushing integration, and they threw cinder blocks through the windows. So what happened was the church put thick plexiglass armor over the windows, and only one window near the top was left without armor. That meant that nobody could see the glass, and the sun could not play on the glass either. About 5 years ago, they took the armor off the windows during a big restoration of the church. It cost $2 million to restore the church, so that for the first time since 1972, the original presentation of the sun going through the windows could be seen. I tell you, it will bring tears to your eyes to go there and see this. And if you're nice to the deacon, he'll let you go up to that tower at the very top where the windows are, and you can have a view of Boston from the top. So there's another church in the Back Bay called the Church of the Covenant. I don't have a picture of it here, but it also has a gigantic Tiffany collection, including the largest Tiffany lantern in the world hanging from the ceiling. But it's an active church that's often in use. It's hard to see it. This is one of the most secret free things that you'll find in Boston, the Mbta Command Center tour. They only offer this tour a few times a year, and only about 8 to 10 people are allowed to go. You have to call up and find out when they're going to offer the tour, but it is free. The RT service started in 1693 as a boat ferry service, and it grew and grew and grew until we have what we recognize now. Now, just as an aside, I'm going to tell you about the 4 lines: the orange line, the red line, the green line, the blue line. We have the red line because it's named for the Crimson of Harvard University. We have the green line because that circles the Frederick Law Olmsted emerald necklace of going around Boston. We have the blue line because it goes under the harbor, the blue water of the harbor. And we have the orange line because it went down what used to be called Orange Street. Orange Street's gone now, but the orange line was named for Orange Street, but that was only a coincidence. It was originally supposed to be the yellow line, but when they started putting up all the signs, they realized that the white lettering on the yellow signs couldn't be read. So they changed it to orange, and they said, we're going to name it after Orange Street. So that's why we have those lines. This tour is free. It's very hard to get into, but it's interesting if you can get into it. As an aside, the MBTA also offers on Halloween a very limited tour of the abandoned subway stations near Scollay Square. There are 4 of them. The BU Observatory is also free. On Thursday nights, they'll let anybody come up and look through their giant telescopes at the sky. Who knows? Maybe you'll meet Rajesh Kuthrapali there. You never know. So you have to get a ticket to go see this from Eventbrite. If you're not a member of Eventbrite, or if you're not familiar with Eventbrite, I highly recommend that you go online and make an account with them. It's free. It doesn't cost any money. And they send you notices for all the free stuff that's happening in Boston, and you can go visit through them. This is one of my favorite things ever. This is the Chestnut Hill pumping station. Almost nobody knows this is here. So a long time ago, Boston used to get its water from the Chestnut Reservoir in Natick, and it was brought to Cleveland Circle, where there's a little reservoir there. So there was a gigantic steam pumping station built to pump the water all through Boston. But then over time, the thing fell into disuse and decay and was abandoned in 1979. They were going to tear it down and make condos there. And in fact, they did tear down the giant coal yard and put in giant condos there, but they saved the steam pump house, which you can go in and see for free. There is a small tour that will take you around, and they'll show you the architecture and these gigantic steam engines, which are of the same class of steam engine that were used on the Titanic. So they have 3 different types of giant steam engines in here. And for a time, they were thinking about getting a compressed air plant so they could fire those engines up again. I was very excited about that. They tried to get Jay Leno involved, but it didn't happen. So they like you to give a donation. It's free, but if you can throw them $5, they would appreciate it. So the Massachusetts Archives, if you're the type of person who likes to see the Declaration of Independence, the original one, and all the original Massachusetts documents, including the bill that Paul Revere charged to Massachusetts for his ride, his midnight ride, then you can go to the archives and see them. Otherwise, this building is really pretty boring. So it is on Columbia Point and near the JFK Museum, which is also free. And you can go and see the Declaration of Independence, which is close to my heart. So I do like to go and see that from time to time. This thing is awesome. Blue Hills Climbing Park, right? So there was a gigantic quarry up on the top of Blue Hills called the Blue Hill Quarries. And it was started by a man named Jason Gridley. Gridley Bryant. Jason Gridley is somebody else. Gridley Bryant was an engineer who started this quarry to make the granite for the Bunker Hill Monument. So it was in operation until 1965, when it was closed down, and the quarry filled with water, and it was 250 feet deep, and people used to swim in it, and they would drown. And finally, the city decided to put all the dirt from the big dig. They needed some place to dump it, so they filled up the quarry with all the dirt. And the result was these gigantic towering mountains of rock, which people have now taken over as a rock climbing park. So I cannot stress to you enough about the surreal nature of this rock climbing park. There is so much. I could give a separate tour or presentation on the Blue Hills alone, but this here is one of the jewels of the Blue Hills, and it's hidden. And a short walk from here is the first railroad in America, which was also made by Gridley Bryant, to move the granite up and down to the Ponset River to be barged over to Bunker Hill. It's also the first place where people died in a train accident in America too. They went right off a cliff when the train broke free from its mountings. So another cool thing about this is very nearby is the Granite Links. You can drive to the top of the hill and have a beer and a burger at an outdoor cafe and have the best view of Boston from the south that you could possibly imagine. This is really a very cool way to spend an afternoon if you like to walk. Community boating in Boston on the Esplanade. I did this as a child. This is the first and oldest boating organization in America. There are a lot of walking trails here. And so this is really cool because for children of Boston, they will give the child a boat and train him how to sail it for $1 for the whole summer. I did it for $1 back when I was young. It's a 14-foot Mercury. You can see them there in a little lagoon, and they teach you to sail. Now, if you want to be an adult and do this, just $250, and then you can come out, and if there's a free boat, they can let you can take the boat out and sail all around the Charles River Basin. Or if you're just an average person, you can go out there and put your name on a list, and one of the students will take you out into Charles River for free. And you have the exciting risk of having the boat capsize in the basin, and you have to be rescued, which is much better now than when I did it. When I did it, you had to worry about getting hepatitis. The Boston Fire Museum, as I've said previously, this is not a great museum because the real museum burned down. This is what's left after that museum burned down. This is on Congress Street in South Boston near the Faneuil project. And it's an original old fire station. And it has some old fire engines in it. And it has the very first fire engine in Boston, which is actually no bigger than a child's wagon with a hand pump in it, because that's how they used to put out fires in those days. And that's where we get the expression fire plug. Boston had the first piped in water system in America, and the pipes were made out of wood. So if a house was burning down, they would dig down to the pipe, drill a hole in it, put in the hose, and a bunch of men would man the pump, and they would pump this garden hose on the fire. Then when they were done, they would punch a wooden plug into the hole that they drilled, and that's where the expression fire plug comes from. And it's free. This is really awe-inspiring. I can't say enough about the Etherdome. This is at Mass General Hospital. There are a lot of other things to see around there as well as this, but this is where the first use of ether as an anesthetic was performed. This room has not been changed since 1843, 1846, when Dr. William Morton did that. Now, at that time, there was a lot of people who were trying to scam the medical establishment about anesthetic. And Dr. Joseph Warren, who was the first head of medicine at Harvard, said it was all garbage. He said it wasn't true. It wasn't possible that anesthetic could work. So when Morton did the surgery, he had Warren come and watch. And when it was over, they woke the guy up. And the guy said he didn't feel any pain from the operation at all. And Dr. Warren said the famous words that changed history: "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." And from there, ether went on to be used as an anesthetic with great success throughout the world. It was one of the four major functions of medicine that they were able to conquer, the first one being pain. So you can go in here. They do have lectures from time to time. It is a working hospital. It's hard to find this. You have to actually ask them where it is. Nearby is Warren. Dr. Joseph Warren started his own museum of medical oddities. So when people would die of bizarre things, he would keep the bodies or the bones or the killing instruments and put them behind glass. And you can see some pretty bizarre stuff. And that's also free. There's a great big statue in the public garden that commemorates this event, by the way, but they don't give any credit to William Morton because so many people were involved in the use of ether as an anesthetic that instead it is just an angel holding a man, demonstrating a wounded man, demonstrating the relieving of pain. It's a great memorial, and they just spent millions of dollars to restore it in the past 5 years or so. So if you find yourself in the public garden, you should look it up. This is a beautiful thing, the Peace Garden on MGH. I had a friend who was in MGH for a serious illness, and while we were there, we would come to this Peace Garden and pray for her recovery. And the thing about this garden is that it's free and anybody can attend it, and it gives a high view of the Charles River Basin area. So it's really beautiful. It is one of the things that you can do if you go to the Etherdome or the Museum of Medical Oddities. You can also visit this as well and take a few minutes out to reflect on your life and look at the beautiful views of Boston. The Museum of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery is an amazing museum that nobody knows about. It is the third oldest military organization in the world, the oldest in America. And it is hidden at the top of Faneuil Hall. So when you walk into Faneuil Hall and you see that big green dome, in that big green dome is this museum. And it is largely a ceremonial museum. And what has happened is all the people who have gone through the military in our country, who have joined the Ancient and Honorable Artillery, have donated incredible artifacts. For example, the first Gatling gun ever made is here. And this cannon is there. And this cannon has an incredible history. It was made in Holland in the 1600s, captured by the British, brought to America to use in the Revolutionary War, captured by the Americans by a New York regiment at Saratoga. The New Yorkians used it to fight the rebels during the Civil War. The rebels captured it. They used it against the Union. A Massachusetts regiment captured it, brought it back to Massachusetts. where it was then used against rioters during the police strike of 1919. So what we have is a cannon that has been in constant use for over 300 years. So there are all kinds of things like this in this museum, and it's free. The Arnold Arboretum and World's End are two great works of nature that you can go to see. Highly recommend going to see the World's End. However, it is out of the way to go see. But these are great walking parks, picnic parks, places on the ocean where you can see nature, and they're huge. So it's worth going to see. And Castle Island I talked about already. So the Lawn at D is a big park that's right next to the convention center in South Boston. When they made the new Fan Pier project, they really were light on parks. So what they did was they put this gigantic park next to the convention center, and it has cornhole and swings, and there are things for children and adults. There's a bar, you can rent it out, or you can just go there and spend an afternoon drinking coffee or sitting in the hammocks or playing cornhole and having a beer. But it's free to go, and you can rent it out too. This is in Marblehead, the Spirit of 1776 painting, one of the greatest paintings in American history by Archibald McNeill Williams. So this painting is absolutely massive. And if you go to the Marblehead City Hall, they have a bunch of other artworks, but none of them are worth seeing except for this gigantic, massive painting. When he started painting this, he started it out as a gag. He was just going to make a postcard and send it to his friends. But people loved it so much that he made it a gigantic painting and brought it to Washington, D.C., and it made a tour of the United States. And he made a whole bunch of little ones as well. There is a full-size copy of this painting in the U.S. State House in Washington, D.C., and it's well worth a pilgrimage to go see this tribute to our nation. By the way, the old man in the middle was his father, who posed for this, who also fought at the Revolutionary War. Faneuil Hall is a tourist trap of immense proportions. It has a lot of historical things to see and a lot of stores to visit and food to eat and things to go. And it doesn't cost anything to go there, but everything you see there has a large price tag attached to it. One of the cool things about this is they have the Nova Scotia Christmas tree. When Nova Scotia was blown up in 1917, when an ammunition ship exploded, Boston was the first city to arrive on the scene with medical supplies. And as in gratitude, they provided us with the biggest spruce fir that they could possibly find. And every year since 1917, they have been shipping us this Christmas tree, and they put it up and it has 1 million lights on it. And then there's a big ceremony where they light it up and band play, and it's well worth going to see. The Secret Garden is a really secret garden in Kendall Square in Cambridge. It's on the top of a parking garage, and the only way to get there is through an unmarked door in the parking garage. You can access it through the Marriott Hotel if you're a guest. But when you go up there, it has cornhole and food and hammocks and little places where you can sit and enjoy this little greenery, this area of greenery in the middle of nowhere. You absolutely would not know it was there if you didn't know it was there. And the Paul Revere locks. This is one of my most enjoyable things I like to take people to. As you see here, the level of the Charles River is lower or higher than Boston Harbor due to the tides. So what they do is they built these locks to control the Charles River, and boats have to go in the locks, and they raise the boats up or they lower them down. And then you can watch them doing this. Now, see in the distance, you can see that bridge, that drawbridge that's up behind the Leonard Zakim Bridge. That is the North Station drawbridge, and they'll blow the whistle 3 times, and then they raise the bridge up, and then no trains can go across. And then the boats will come down the river, and they'll go in the locks, and they'll go into the harbor. So if you like that sort of thing, if you're interested in how things work, or if you want to walk from the north end to see the USS Constitution, the best cut through is through the locks. It's a path. It's part of the Emerald Necklace that goes over these locks to the Paul Revere Park on the right. Now, that Charles River Bridge in front there has all been torn down. They're building a new bridge there. But at one time, that bridge was the longest bridge in the world. Old City Hall is another place to go if you want to see everything. You can stand at any place in Old City Hall and turn in a circle and see something famous. This statue of Ben Franklin was the first statue manufactured in America, when America was America. It has the first firebox. Fire alarms were invented in Boston, and the first firebox in America is here at the station. There is the old Latin School, Boston Latin School Memorial is here. The King's Chapel is here, the first granite building in America. There is so much in this little area, plus Ruth's Chris Steakhouse is right here, where you can have a great steak for lunch. Can't recommend it enough. Oh, and I have to point out the Pie Alley is there, where they were serving cat pies until 1967, made from stray cats. Dorchester Heights has a tower. This is where Washington drove the British out of Boston during Evacuation Day, during the Revolutionary War. I got to tell you, quite frankly, if you're really excited about the Revolutionary War, go see it. Otherwise, there are lots of other things well worth seeing instead. And that's all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed it. I loved giving it. This is my favorite presentation that I love to give. And if you have anything to say, if there's anybody still left, please feel free to offer comments, criticisms, or complaints.
So Jay, we've got about 50 people left. So we'll take about 5 or 10 minutes of questions. Lorraine says, so interesting, and I learned so much, and I have to leave the presentation early. Again, thank you. Alana says, can you expand upon the British soldier found inside a wall? Was it an accident or a homicide?
It was a homicide. You know, he was beaten and put in the wall. He was probably dead. But then they built the wall around him. And Edgar Allan, the legend, no one found him for a long time. But there was always the legend of him being in there. And so Edgar Allan Poe wrote this poem. And during a restoration of the fort, much later, they actually discovered his body in the wall.
Arlene asks, what is the emerald necklace?
Oh, my goodness. Well, so there is a famous architect. His name is Frederick Law Olmsted. And what he did was he decided that Boston needed to be surrounded by a ring of green. And he called it the Emerald Necklace. So Boston consists of a series of massive parks and greenways, such as the Fens and Fenway, that go all around the city. And they extend all the way out to Newton. And what Boston has done is extended that with the Harbor Walk. Boston Harbor is 43 miles long. And by law, no private tenant can stop anybody from walking the entire harbor. And the only break in that path that goes around the harbor is the Coast Guard base, because of security concerns that they closed that off after 9/11.
Let's see here. Okay. Shinwei asks, why is there an FBI background check to enter the Deer Island sewage treatment plant?
Because the Deer Island sewage treatment plant is the greatest, biggest bomb in Boston. Those big tanks are filled with methane gas, and if terrorists hit them, they could blow up the city. It has also got a concentration of sodium hypochlorite, which they use to sterilize the water, which if it was exploded, would poison the entire city. So you have to be checked out before you can go there so they can make sure you're not a terrorist.
Gerard says, great job. Judy says, excellent presentation. Mariette says, thank you. We have a great time and make a long list of places to go. Marie says, so informative. Thanks for your enthusiasm and research. Let's see. Pat says, great presentation as usual. I continue to be amazed by your knowledge. Shinwei asks, how long is each MBTA command center tour?
About 90 minutes. You have to actually, they used to publish, but since, they've gotten a lot more skittish in recent years about it because of terrorist concerns. Mm-hmm. But if you call them up and ask them if they are going to and when they're going to do another tour and that you'd like to be added to the list, because it really is an incredible tour. It's like going into mission control at NASA. So you can go down there and see how the trains move around the whole city. It's really very interesting. And the tour guide tells you all about how the T works, and he'll tell you about all the new things that they're doing on the T as well.
All right, I think, let's see, did I miss anything? Marie says Wormouth's was a great restaurant that no longer is open. What else? Let's see, I got one last question here. Barbara asks, is the Custom House Tower tour still available?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. It is and it isn't. You actually have to call up and arrange to let you go up there. After the pandemic is over or whatever, they'll probably bring it back. It's $5. It's not free. It's $5 to go up there. And, you know, again, I say this about everything, but when I bring people to Boston, if there are only a handful of things to do, that's one of the ones I would do is the Custom House Tower tour. Is absolutely spectacular.
All right. Shinwei, wow, thank you so much for this interesting and enlightening presentation. So Jay, we're going to see you in 4 weeks. What are we going to learn in 4 weeks with your 5th presentation?
Okay, now we move on to the part of the presentation that is cheap things to do in Boston. Talked about the free things. The next one is now cheap things.
All right, excellent, excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to that. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library. Thanks the Manchester by the Sea Library. Look for an email from me later today with a feedback survey, with the recording, and with information about upcoming Boston history related programs, including Jay's program in a few weeks. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.